Hi, everyone. It has been a truly incredible time since I was last live, but I'm so excited to be back. Today, in order to start off spooky season, we are going to be talking about Xibalba and the mythical Hills, which are a certain type of monstrous creature that inhabits Xibalba. I'm very excited to be here. I have missed live streaming in the months since my last live stream. My health has been very precipitous and it has not been a fun journey. So the fact that I am here at all is very exciting. I'm so happy to be here and to be in front of a camera again. For those of you who don't know, the last live stream series that I was in was a telenovela series entitled Rosas y Pistolas, which was done by some of my friends, some of my new friends. And during that time, I realized that I have acid reflux, and it took a moderate toll on my health and prevented me from doing just so many of the things that I really wanted to do. So I am excited to be back. This is an experimental live stream as I attempt to get used to live streaming again. Today, we are going to be talking about Pathfinder, myths and legends. We're going to be talking about some of the lore in Pathfinder and having generally just a really fun time with it. So in order to go ahead and dive right back on in, we are going to go ahead and start talking about Xibalba. Xibalba is a place that was inspired by an actual mythological place in Mayan folklore, but we are not going to be talking about the real life Xibalba today. That is too complex of a topic for me to talk about in this format. So instead, we're just going to be talking about the Pathfinder version of it, which is something that I think is incredibly interesting and is generally just a really fun way. Yes, I do have more beard than usual, Adam. Also, hey, Daryl, I see you. I also saw Tria. Tria is not going to be able to be in the chats today, I think, but I really appreciate that she stopped on by to say hello. I definitely have more beard than I have had in the past. My face has just become one big beard in the time since my last live stream, but I personally really like it. So in order to start us talking about the topic at hand, the spooky topic, Xibalba is a demiplane, which means that unlike many of the other dimensions, also, hey Tria, I'm glad that you are still here. I'm sorry that you're not feeling well, but I'm excited that you are in the audience tonight. That always makes me feel a little bit better when I know that there's at least a couple of people, especially since it's been such a long time since I've done a stream. But Xibalba is a very fascinating place that is classified as a demiplane. A demiplane is not one of the grand spheres or universes that exist in the Great Beyond, which is the collective term for the multiverse that Pathfinder 1E and 2E take place in, but rather is a sort of almost artificial dimension that actually has finite boundaries and has definitive properties that are static and largely unchanging, although that doesn't mean that they are conditions that are stable for mortal life forms. As an example of this, some of the qualities of Xibalba specifically are that it is a largely predatory place where magic is enhanced, and it has the ability to sort of attack non-native visitors who attempt to intrude upon it. The ways that it does this, since it is the dimension of dread, is that it causes little feelings for people, such as the feelings of insects crawling on people's skin. It does things like provoke anxiety attacks and is generally just an extraordinarily unpleasant place to visit. It is actually so malevolent that at times when armed invasions of Xibalba have taken place, people who have teleported there have found themselves teleported onto the corpses of the people they were going to rescue. And also, the place itself is at times capable of messing with visitors and intruders so much so that they end up getting misdirected and going into places where their fears, their like personal fears, are actually exacerbated, which is one of the reasons why I think it's a really cool place to talk about. Well, Daryl, one of the reasons for going there is that it is a fascinating place of study for various people in Pathfinder settings, such as nihilists, people who want to. It's it's like fantasy nihilism, it's not real life nihilism. So it's like nihilism, everything is bad and stuff. And like in fantasy RPGs, if you're a nihilist, you're like generally considered to be one of the worst sorts of people. It's the same thing with like fantasy atheism, where it's like if you're an atheist in these sorts of settings, it's really bad. I think it's a very interesting discussion for another day. But generally, people who go there who are not interested in learning about fear or in dealing with the Sac Hills, who are the natives of the place, are generally trying to rescue people who've been trapped there, taken there by different types of Sac Hills, which are the natives that we are going to be talking about in a little bit, or trying to get some of the resources of the place. It's also a very powerful dimension, despite the fact that it's a demiplane. There is actually a race of demigods that live there and that try and do all sorts of scary things to the unfortunate people that they manage to trap. It's also the home of Kamatz, who is one of the divinities of darkness and bats. And I actually really like it. I think it's a really cool place for a campaign, such as if you're trying to like rescue someone or if you get trapped there and you have to escape. But unfortunately, Sac Hills are one of the groups of monstrous entities in Pathfinder where there's not really many low-level Sac Hills. So generally, if you are dealing with them, it's going to be really dangerous for a low-level party, but it could be really interesting if you're a higher-level party. I want us to start talking about some of the geography, some of the geographical elements of Xibalba, because people who are in the know about different, hey Jessica, some of the people who are in the know about Xibalba have actually written in universe and talked about Xibalba's properties and talked about the different locations scattered throughout Xibalba. If you are on the surface, also, if you guys hear me talking a little bit slower than usual, it's because I'm feeling a little funny. Acid reflux has that sort of effect on someone like me who likes to talk a lot, which is one of the reasons I've been nervous about live streaming. But on Xibalba's surface, the primary feature of note is a ruined city that features a geographical place known as the Black Pyramid. The Black Pyramid is a pyramid that sits atop the tallest hill in the city, and it is the home of the Sac Hill Tormentors, which are the highest level Sac Hill entities that have been recorded so far. They are unique demigod level entities that are capable of doing things like granting their followers spells and that have malevolent plots that involve the different material worlds that exist throughout the Great Beyond. This Black Pyramid has lots of different torture chambers and it has lots of different ritual chambers. It's actually, if you are into like a dark campaign or if you want to feature like evil NPCs and stuff, this is a really rad place to do a lot of different stuff. In the future, I'm probably going to do a live stream where I just talk about like my ideas for campaigns set in Galarian. And I would definitely be talking about places like Xibalba and Abaddon, which is the dimensional home of the daemons, in great detail because those places are of incredible interest to me. But outside of the city and the Black Pyramid, the other places of note are a dense forest that surrounds the city on all sides. And then outside of that, the final little zone that exists on the surface of Xibalba is actually 4 different areas. There is a icy tundra, a blazing inferno, a disgusting march, and a rugged, oppressive canyon. All of these things talk about and touch on different aspects of fear and different types of fear, and they're all inhabited by different creatures that exist throughout both the Great Beyond generally and also Xibalba specifically, which, as I've talked about and we'll talk about later on in this, has its own little almost native race, which are really cool to fight and to mess around with. But the actual place that interests most people who write and talk about Xibalba is its underground region. Xibalba is much like Galarian, which is the main planet that most Pathfinder adventures will take place on, in that it is kind of a hollow planet. There is tremendous, literally thousands upon thousands of miles or kilometers, depending on where you live, of underground region that can be explored, much like Galarian's Darklands, which is effectively Pathfinder's version of the Underdark, if you're familiar with Faerun, which is the Forgotten Realms campaign setting. And these underground areas are divvied up into massive mile-long caverns that each follow their own little rules. Would a normal druid be able to use the force to their advantage, or would they need some sort of blessing? That's actually a really good question. I feel like a lot of people would probably homebrew a rule that says that you could use your magic as normal in that setting if you are a druid, but there's nothing actually super explicit about it. But some types of magic, like teleportation magic and evocation magic, are actually enhanced if you are in Xibalba. So certain types of spells would have extra effects and would inflict more damage and stuff if you use them, especially if you are a certain type of caster, which is one of the reasons why if you go into like the Pathfinder wiki and you go over to Xibalba's like a little entry, it says that magic is enhanced there. But these underground regions, some of the regions that have been detailed are, according to survivors, alleged to be caverns that are home to places like Blood Rain and Purple Lightning. In one, it's just a really long cavern where if you hear the wind, you hear the wailing of tortured souls being carried on by it. And another is a sort of moon-sized cavern covered in ice and snow, where through some sort of metaphysical property in the region, you actually feel isolated from everyone around you, even if you have like an adventuring party with you. How that would actually affect the sort of like gameplay of such an area is largely up to specific DMs, but I think that this sort of flavor is really cool and can be used creatively by a lot of DMs who are willing to sit down and map out places like this, which is one of the reasons why I want to have this series where we talk about things that involve either higher level elements or involve adventures beyond Galarian, which is a really cool setting, but is like limited in a lot of ways, especially because Pathfinder often wants you to go on adventures in places beyond Galarian. There are actually places on Earth that you can visit if you are playing a Pathfinder adventure. And I think that's a really fun thing, but I hope more people start to take advantage of in the future. So I've already talked about how Xibalba is alive. So I think that the next thing that we are going to be talking about today are the Sekhiels. Sekhiels are a unique race of outsiders that call Xibalba home, in the sense that when they get kicked out of places like Galarian or another place in the material plane, which is what we call the sort of universe where mortals live. It's where Earth is located. It's where Galarian's located, and a bunch of other planets and stuff. That is where they get sent back to. So in lots of different TTRPGs, if you defeat an outsider in battle and you are on the material plane, the outsider gets expelled to whatever dimension they are native to, or whatever dimension they call home. Sakhils are a little bit weird in the sense that they're an outsider race that is a like somewhat well-detailed outsider race in Pathfinder, but that isn't the result of transformed souls. Psychopomps, demons, devils, all of which we've talked about in some level of detail in the past in the series, are the results of souls that went to an outer plane and that underwent a process after surviving usually a couple hundred to a couple thousand years, where they became outsiders as opposed to just being souls that existed on planes. So Balors are kind of a funny example, but Balors are demons, and they are the results of either one soul or like a group of evil souls on the abyss surviving for a couple thousands of years and evolving into demons who evolved into Balors. But Sakhils are not that way. Sakhils started off their existence as mortals who died and became psychopomps, which are spirits of death that monitor and protect the River of Souls and the Bone Lands and serve Pharasma, the goddess of fate and death. But then they rebelled against her and they decided to embrace entropy, embrace fear, and they became a whole new species of creature known as Sakhils. Sackills are very interesting creatures because they embody and they are empowered by fear. There's different types of Sackills that manifest as different sorts of fears, and they use abilities based on the fears that they manifest. Also, I'm going to go ahead and say this right now. It's entirely possible this will be a shorter live stream than usual. I'm still trying to build up the tolerance to do longer live streams after my health basically kind of collapsed in August and in July. So we are going to get back to longer live streams eventually, but just not right now. So the River Styx is kind of a thing in Pathfinder. I think that the River Styx is explicitly a thing that exists in Abaddon, but the River of Souls is not the River Styx. And Sackhills reproduce because psychopomps can rebel and embrace sort of entropy and fear at pretty much any point in their existence. And when they do that, they undergo strange metamorphosis that transforms them into Sackhills. There was one the notes and the lore is kind of fuzzy about this, but it appears that there was one grand rebellion that resulted in the birth of the majority of Sackhill tormentors and lots of entities of like lesser power. And then there is just sort of a continuing process of stagnation where individual psychopomps sort of embrace entropy and nihilism, and then they undergo this metamorphosis that leaves them as Sackhills of different levels of strength. A psychopomp usher, which is a psychopomp that is at demigod level strength and has followers and stuff, can undergo this process and also become Sackhill Tormentor, but that's pretty rare. Usually, the majority of Sackhill Tormentors that exist nowadays are widely believed to have come about probably during that same general Grand Rebellion. And so this is a constant thing because people keep dying. Kind of like lots, that's the sort of thing that wears down on the souls and on the morality of the psychopomps who watch over the River of Souls. It's not the only thing that can result in this gradual soul level corruption, but it is one of the things. There are some Sackhill tormentors. We're going to talk about two of them when we talk about Sackhill tormentors specifically, that have different origins, but it is really interesting to think about the sorts of different things that can occur to cause a psychopomp usher to become a Sackhill tormentor. And actually, a really fun campaign idea would be like a long-term campaign where the players befriend psychopomps and they get to see them becoming Sackhills, and they can intervene to stop that from happening, maybe through like a series of like friendship related things or like things that would uplift the soul of the psychopomp in question to keep them from questioning their duty. But generally, it seems like this is a thing that starts off small and then snowballs into something very big. At the time of the rebellion of the first Sackhills, the first psychopomps who rejected their duty to Pharasma and embraced entropy and fear, it seems like the general hierarchy of Sackhill society, insofar as they could be said to have a society, was decided when lesser, weaker psychopomps became Sackhills that embraced more basic fears, such as the fear of like animals or parasitism or getting sick. And stronger Sackhills became they embrace sort of weirder, more esoteric fears, things related to the supernatural, things related to souls. And then the very strongest psychopomps who fell, the ushers who rebelled, and also like almost usher level beings who fell, have embraced sort of terror on a larger societal wide scale. And they are now inside of the Black Pyramid. They have legions of followers, and they're doing lots of like really strange things to spread fear to entire planets or entire planes. But right now, generally speaking, what a Sackhill does, if it's stuck in Xibalba, is that they actually are. Sackhill Tormentors attract a wide range of worshippers, and I think that's a very interesting thing. Like all other demigod level entities, they are able to demand obediences, which are daily rituals in Pathfinder, that if you perform them, your god or goddess will grant you a boon. Lots of different things can demand obediences, and they can actually like grant the power that comes with them. I think that's a really fun thing to talk about. I wish that I had had like the list of obediences in front of me, but it is in one of the books that I do not have access to at the moment. It is explicitly outlined in the Book of the Damned, which is a Pathfinder supplemental resource from first edition that outlines all of the fiends, which are evil outsiders of various types, and talks about the ones that are either at demigod level or in a few cases are at like actual deity level. There are all sorts of different obediences. Some of them involve just like some of them involve doing things to yourself, but lots of them involve doing things to other people. Generally speaking, stronger entities will demand more brutal obediences that will actually do something to your player character and aren't just like flavor text effectively. Some of them, for instance, demand that you like sacrifice someone every so often, or that you inflict damage to either yourself or someone that you care about in a like specific way that doesn't heal, but in exchange you get like a boost to your AC or something, which just makes you harder to hit. So let's see what else I have on the notes. I'm actually tearing through this much faster than I expected, which is good because that gives me time to just sort of talk about like my homebrew ideas for Sack Hills and stuff. But generally speaking, Sack Hill Tormentors gather worshippers from the most like nihilistic and depraved sorts of people throughout the Great Beyond. Generally speaking, if you worship someone like the Great Old Ones or the Outer Gods, which are another set of evil peeps we'll talk about later, then you are just a nihilist. But if you are one of the people who is most likely to worship a Sackle Tormentor, at least if you do this like knowingly, generally it's implied that you're not just nihilistic, but also that you want to spread suffering to other people, which is a very interesting thing that I think is really neat and also like really dark. Pathfinder is capable of surprising darkness when they're actually willing to like go there. So I think that's kind of cool if that's a sort of campaign that you would like to run. But let's see. So one of the last things that I wanted to talk about was the sort of foreign relationships that the Sack Hills have with lots of other entities. In a future video or live stream, I'll probably talk about like individual types of Sack Hills, but this is talking more about them on a like social scale, which I think is really fun. Generally speaking, the allies and admirers of the Sack Hills are creatures like daemons and divs. Daemons are neutral evil fiends that are nihilistic and seek nothing short of the end of all things. They want to devour souls. They want to fuck around on the River of Souls and keep people from finding out. You actually can become a god in Pathfinder, Daryl. I have talked about that in another video that I thought was really neat. We talked about the tests of the Starstone and the Ascended, which are a group of people who have passed a test on Galarian and have actually become deities. There's also adventure paths that end or feature like halfway points where you become demigods, such as, spoiler alert, I guess, Wrath of the Righteous, where that is a possible ending, but not necessarily the ending that you get. I don't know if that's the same thing in the video game, but I do know that that is a possible ending in the adventure path. There is a difference between demons and daemons. Demons are chaotic evil, and daemons are neutral evil. Daemons are also older, and some of the first demons were created by daemons. But daemons are like nihilistic assholes who want to eat souls, and they'll do everything they can to destroy everything. Divs serve a specific god, but they're effectively either evil, they're not quite evil genies, but they're like evil undead genies and like minions of evil undead genies. This is a great bastardization of a really complex set of lore that I will be talking about in detail at a later date. But both of them are nihilists that seek to bring about the ruin and end of all things. So they really admire and, in fact, sometimes actually work with Sackhills, which is very interesting to me. Chitons, which are, I believe, lawful evil, are a type of outsider as well that sometimes works with them. Chitons include chain devils, which are not actually devils in Pathfinder, but are just a type of race that's close enough to devils that they're often sort of grouped together. But Chitons also have their own race of demigods, as do the daemons. The divs don't, because they serve one great evil god of destruction and ruin, who's also a demigod, but is like a really interesting one named Amirin. And he's definitely gonna get like a dedicated video thing in the future because he's really interesting and people don't put enough respect on Amirin's name. I wish that people would like talk more about the expanded bestiaries and stuff that exist in Pathfinder, because those are all really neat. But some of the more interesting little tidbits about Sackhills include their relationships with the Queens of the Night, who we have talked about in the past. In the past, we have talked about one of the Queens of the Night named Mathalia, whose name I always have a difficult time pronouncing, and I'm doing my best. She is known as the Dowager of Illusions, and she is a psychopomp usher who fell and became corrupted. When she fell and she became corrupted, she spent a long period of time in Xibalba. And in Xibalba, she was either vibing with some of the other fallen psychopomps, or she was running amok. And because of this, she's had interesting relationships with numerous Sackhill tormentors. The most prominent of these is Agra, the Red Wife, who is supposedly Mathala's daughter. Another one is named Ellie, and this is an incredibly mysterious Sackhill tormentor of which virtually nothing is known, but she confesses to owing Mathala various favors. And the final person of note here is known as Bellytoad Goremouth, and Bellytoad Goremouth got absolutely demolished by Mathala and despises her openly and would very happily take a bite out of her if it got the chance. There are also numerous lesser Sackhills who survived her wrath, who admire her and fear her in like equal measure, because they're just like, damn, that's a scary lady, and we really like scary ladies. So I think that's really neat. But one of the really interesting little tidbits about Mathala is that like her fascination, that the fascination that she elicits from the Sackhills is not only something that is like one-sided. She openly invites more scholarly Sackhills to her home, and her home's name is Aditon, which is a mindscape, which is a demiplane that exists. Hey, KCA, it's really nice to see you. I'm really glad that people are able to stop on by and say hello. We are going to be doing more live streams in the future, but yeah, as I mentioned before, Aditon is a very fascinating mindscape. It is a demiplane that exists solely in the mind. It is named after a drug that Mathala's followers ingest and imbibe to go and sort of vibe with their strange demigoddess lady. And they go over to her temple in Aditon and they share insights and they learn stuff in return. So there's actually a very interesting possibility if you would like to be like, what are the sorts of relationships that different factions can have? It's really interesting to me that at least some Sackhills can vibe with some devils and other less destructive forces, because one of the things about creatures like the Sackhills Sackills, and also like the Daemons, is that they are hated by pretty much everyone else out there, because what they're doing is trying to effectively end all things. Now, the Sackhills don't really care about ending things. They really like fear. They want to like devour fear, and they want to ingest it. But what they are doing is disrupting the natural flow of life, and it is accelerating the inevitable death of the Pathfinder multiverse. When the Pathfinder multiverse dies, there will be another one that follows. But obviously, if you're someone who's living in this multiverse now, you don't want it to end. So obviously, you would act against forces that are either intentionally or otherwise seeking to speed up the end of all things. There are different groups that are known to invade Xibalba. One of the biggest groups are known as the Manisputras, and they are creatures that inhabit the positive energy plane. They are effectively enlightened mortals who sort of transcended, and they underwent a spiritual process that resulted in them going to the positive energy plane when they died and becoming that kind of outsider. And their entire civilization is well known for launching raids on Xibalba and attempting to sort of take people back from Xibalba, and also, when possible, permanently destroy Sackhills so as to lessen the number of creatures that are out there speeding about the end of all things. Now, that's really one of the last little major points, but if you're curious about the identities of some of the major Sackhill tormentors, in addition to the two that I have already talked about, some of the more interesting ones are Sipkana, who is perhaps the most well-known tormentor, and he's also the main one for which like art is available. He's just a really gigantic crocodile with 4 eyes. He is interested in violence, shifting earth, and general laziness, but also specifically the evasion of responsibility. He is also in canon suggested to be perhaps the most well-known of the tormentors generally. All of his followers really don't like working for him because they are also victims of his violence. But in a place where fear is power, obviously being disliked by your subordinates would just make you beefier in general. Another really interesting one is Sharonri, who interestingly works against her peers but is largely below their notice, probably for some sort of like ability reason as opposed to her being actively weaker than the others. Her areas of interest are isolation, lost time, and loneliness. So let's see. Something weird's happening to the microphone. I'm getting weirdly quiet. That's strange. Let me just. Can people still hear me? We are actually almost done anyway, and this is largely experimental. I'm not using my main computer, I'm using my MacBook, and I don't tend to use it for live streams. So let me see. This is a learning experience before I get back to using my big computer where I have my microphone again. But also, this is mostly like for fun and to get my channel active again anyway. I do plan to do more serious and structured Pathfinder myths and legends videos. But I think from all the stuff that I've talked about here, it's really obvious why I think it'd be really interesting. Let's see. I will move my computer and let me see if that helps the microphone. I think it should, hopefully. Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, hopefully that will help a little. But yeah, I obviously am really into Xibalba. I think it's an extremely fascinating campaign setting, and it's one of many dimensions in Pathfinder that has not been especially fleshed out. But there's enough there that if you look through like all of the lore, you can get a really interesting picture. I think having a campaign that is either set primarily in Xibalba or features like a sort of end game component where the players openly adventure into Xibalba would be incredibly interesting. There are a number of ways and a number of reasons why high level adventurers would have hooks to go there. But also, there's the very legitimate possibility of them getting kidnapped and being forcibly brought there, either by the minions of tormentors or by unfortunate events that drag their world into close proximity to Xibalba. Xibalba is actually located on the ethereal plane, and the main reason why it's located on the ethereal plane is that that's close to the material plane. That is one of the transitive dimensions in Pathfinder, and as such, it is easier for creatures that are there to slip into the mortal world. And many sack hills are well known for being able to get summoned by mortal sorcerers or conjurers or wizards and then escape the bounds of confinement. In fact, some of them actually are well known assholes who will get summoned deliberately. They will escape the bonds of the things that are keeping them bound. They'll talk to the people who summon them, and then they'll use the things that they learned against their summoners in ways to either hurt them on like a 1-to-1 level or sort of make them afraid. I think that this is a really fascinating idea, especially because generally speaking, lots of players like the idea of like summoning minions and then thinking that they can trust those minions pretty reliably. But Zach Hills are basically written to be like, maybe you shouldn't do that. And if you're a summoner who summons things irresponsibly, there will be consequences for your actions, which I think is incredibly neat. I also think it'd be a really cool campaign to that talks about the different evil factions in Pathfinder and then creates one like long-term adventure path where you deal with different high-level groups such as like the demon lords and then the archdevils, and finally you go and you deal with like the Sackhill tormentors, which is really interesting because Sackhill tormentors and the like other smaller demigods are sometimes implied to be weaker in one-on-one fights, but because there's no canon stat blocks for most of these creatures, it's actually really difficult to show that. Funnily enough, archdevils, I think all of them except for Asmodeus in first edition have stat blocks that people can find and people can use that are like canon stat blocks. But Paizo is one of those companies that doesn't really enjoy the idea of players fighting against demigods and demigod level entities, which is something I've talked about that frustrates me. It's only recently that they've started creating some stat blocks for some demigod level entities, so that way like players can fight against them. There are numerous stat blocks for demon lords that are in the Wrath of the Righteous. All of the archdevils except for Asmodeus have stat blocks that have been written out over the course of several bestiaries and adventure paths. There's a few chitin demigods. I think that's their like demigod level entity that have their stat blocks written out, including one that you can possibly fight in a fairly early first edition adventure path, which was very interesting to me. But also, like the game notes that like if you fight this entity, you're probably gonna die. It's not a good idea. But generally speaking, like it's nice to have the freedom and also to see the sorts of things that like the game designers would think would constitute their entries. I really like that, personally speaking. I wish that we would see more like divine level stuff. Fifth edition also kind of has this. Fifth edition is Dungeons and Dragons. For those of you who either know more about Pathfinder than you know about Dungeons and Dragons, or you don't know anything about Dungeons and Dragons, because I actually know several people whose introductions to TTRPGs are entirely Pathfinder and not at all D&D. But now we're starting to get a little bit more deity level creatures in 5th edition again, which is really funny because 3.5 and 4th edition, I think, both have stat blocks for various either full deities or at least demon lords. 3.5 is actually infamous for this among people who are like really into deity level characters. There's an entire book called Deities and Demigods, which has been published across numerous editions of D&D that has stat blocks for all sorts of deities. And I think that's really neat. I wish that we'd seen more of that. But yeah, this has been a very fun thing to do again. I've really missed live streaming, and I'm excited to be back and conversing with people. I planned to get back into live streaming in August, and then my health fell through. So I'm really happy to be back here and to actually be in front of a camera.
I'm also going to be dropping a link to a Twitter thread in the chat section in like 2 seconds for people who want to know a little bit more about the very hectic month I have had. But yeah, if there are any specific things that you all would be interested in learning about from Sack Hills, in the future, I do plan to talk about them again, where I talk about them on like more of an individual level, where you can get to see different kinds of Sack Hills and the different fears and abilities that they have. I mostly wanted to introduce Sack Hills and Xibalba as a concept before we started getting into the minutia of different types of specific Sack Hills. As I've mentioned, there aren't very many low level Sack Hills, so if you are encountering them, uh, it probably won't be as a random encounter. It'll probably be as something that your adventure, that your game master wants you to get through one way or another. One of the fun things about them is that they have like aura fear abilities where they can basically inflict attacks on your sanity, especially the higher level ones. So just standing close to them can be an unfortunate experience for you. But I think those sorts of enemies are very fascinating because I really like the idea of enemies that are dangerous to you even without turning towards you. Enemies that can do permanent bad stuff to you regardless of whether or not you piss them off. And Sack Hills are definitely those kinds of enemies. In the future, we are going to be doing more live streams. I'm hoping to try and get to do a live stream every weekend. And yeah, I have missed everyone. I'm so happy to be back. And for now, we are going to go ahead and sign off. I hope everyone has a good night. It has been really cool. Some of the auras do work through walls, a lot of them don't. Pathfinder is really funny when it comes to aura effects. So yeah. But bye, everyone.